There is a particular kind of silence in a garden in early spring, and it is not the good kind. It is the silence of a lavender that stood out there all winter looking perfectly ordinary. You walked past it in February and thought nothing of it. And then, somewhere in the 2 or 3 weeks after the ground finally thawed, it quietly stopped being alive. So you go out with your coffee. You snap one of the gray stems and it breaks clean, like a matchstick. You scratch the bark near the base with your thumbnail, looking for that thin green line underneath, and there is nothing there but tan. And then you do the thing every one of us does. You take hold of the whole plant, low down, and you pull, and it lifts, almost no resistance at all. The roots that come up look less like roots and more like wet brown string. And the sentence that comes next is nearly always the same sentence. The winter got it. I want to spend the next little while explaining why that sentence is usually wrong, and why believing it is the exact reason this will happen to you again next year. Here is my claim, stated plainly, because it really is the whole video in one line. Lavender in a home garden almost never dies of cold. It dies of hours. Specifically, it dies of the number of hours the crown of that plant and the top few inches of soil wrapped around it, spent soaking wet during the months when nothing in that garden could dry out. Cold is the accomplice. Water is the killer. Once you see it that way, all the advice you have ever heard about lavender stops being a list of unrelated chores and turns into one single question, asked 5 different ways. I have come to call it the drying window. Think of the base of that plant as holding a bank account, and the currency is not water and it is not fertilizer. The currency is hours. Every hour the crown sits wet is a withdrawal. Every hour it sits dry is a deposit. Rain makes withdrawals. Sun, wind, slope, gravel, and the shape you cut into that shrub all make deposits. Winter does not decide the balance. You do, right now, in the few weeks after the flowers fade, with about 5 decisions. And not one of those 5 costs $1. That matters more than it sounds. There is no bottle for this. Nobody can patent a slope. Nobody can resell airflow, or the shape of a shrub, or a coffee can of gravel out of your own driveway. That is not a conspiracy, it is just arithmetic. Advice that cannot be sold does not get advertised, so it goes quiet. Not wrong, just invisible. And in gardening, the invisible things are usually the ones that decide whether a plant is alive in May. To understand the drying window, you have to understand where this plant grew up, because we have all been told a story about lavender that is only half right. English lavender, botanically Lavandula angustifolia, is not English at all. It comes off the dry limestone hills of the western Mediterranean, thin, stony ground, rock close to the surface, summers long and hot and dry. Now here is the part everybody gets wrong. Those winters are not dry. Mediterranean winters are the wet season. It rains, sometimes a great deal. But on a limestone hillside, the water leaves. It falls. It runs down through fractured rock and gravel and shallow soil. And within an hour, the ground around that plant is damp rather than wet. And by afternoon, it is dry again. The plant gets the rain. It does not get to keep it. So read this next sentence twice, because it is the single most misunderstood thing about this plant. Lavender did not evolve to hate water. It evolved to hate water that stays. Now look at where we actually put it. In much of North America, the wettest season of the year is also the coldest season of the year. The soil is silt or clay rather than limestone rubble. The bed is flat, or worse, slightly dished. There is a downspout somewhere upslope quietly delivering the roof of the house into that corner. And on the day it went in the ground, somebody spread 2 inches of shredded bark right up against the stem, because that is what you do, and because every plant tag in America implies it. We took a plant off a rocky hillside and we set it down in a bathtub. And then, in April, we blamed the weather. I want to get underneath the mechanism, because this is the part almost nobody explains, and once you have it, you will never look at a soggy corner of your yard the same way. 3 things are happening at once. The first is breathing. Roots respire. They burn sugar and they need oxygen to do it, same as you. In a soil with good structure, oxygen travels through the air spaces between crumbs very quickly. In water, Oxygen moves roughly 10,000 times more slowly. That is not a small difference. That is a change of category. So a saturated soil is not really wet soil. It is airless soil. The roots are not drinking too much. They are suffocating. The second is the calendar, and this one is sneaky. In July, a healthy lavender in that same soggy soil would pull the moisture out itself. It is growing and flowering and transpiring hard, and it would drain that little puddle in 2 days without your help. In November, it is doing almost nothing. Same rainfall, but the water now sits 10 times longer because the pump has been switched off for the season. The third is what turns a stress into a death: water molds. The organisms behind most root and crown rot in ornamental plants, Phytophthora and Pythium, are not true fungi at all. They sit on a separate branch of life, closer to algae, and they have a feature true fungi do not. They produce swimming spores with tails that need a continuous film of free water to travel through soil and find a root. Sit with that for a second. Standing water is not just a stress on the plant, it is a road for the thing that eats it. Extension plant pathologists have been saying a version of this for decades. Dr. Gary Moorman, professor emeritus of plant pathology at Penn State, spent years arguing in his extension work on ornamentals that Phytophthora root rot is fundamentally a water management problem rather than a chemical one. Dr. Jim Downer, advisor emeritus with University of California Cooperative Extension in Ventura County, has made much the same case about soil, mulch, and root disease in landscape plants for most of his career. And now the last piece, which explains the sentence you have said or heard 100 times. It looked fine last week. The roots die in December. The top does not fall over, because in December the top is dormant and asking for nothing. March arrives, buds swell on sugars the plant banked last summer, and it pushes a little growth and looks alive, because it is running on savings. Then comes the first genuinely warm, windy, sunny day in April. Demand for water spikes, and there is no root system left to supply it. The plant collapses inside 48 hours. So when somebody tells me their lavender died in April, what I hear is that it died in December. It just did not fall over until April. Which is good news in a way, because December is not where you fix this. Right now is. So, 5 things. Here is the first, and it is the one most people get half right. There are 2 completely different cuts you can make on a lavender, and confusing them is what turns a tight silver mound into a collapsed gray octopus in about 4 years. The first cut is deadheading. Follow a faded flower stalk down to where the first pair of small leaves sits on the stem and cut just above that pair. You can do this the day the color goes dull, and you should. Why bother when the flowers are already finished? 2 reasons. Setting seed costs the plant energy it would rather bank for winter, and a thicket of spent stalks sitting on top of the plant behaves like a thatched roof laid the wrong way up. It catches rain and holds it right over the crown. Withdrawal from the account. The second cut is shaping, and shaping has rules. The rule you have heard is never cut into old wood. That is correct. What almost nobody tells you is why, and the why is what lets you make confident decisions instead of nervous ones. Lavender is not a herbaceous perennial. It is a subshrub, which means the base of it is genuinely woody and permanent, while the top is soft and renewable. In lavender, the buds capable of producing new shoots are concentrated in this year's and last year's leafy growth. Down in the old gray hardwood at the base, dormant buds are few and unreliable, and in an older plant, they may effectively be gone. So when you cut back into bare gray stick, the plant is not sulking or punishing you. There is simply nothing left there to push. You have removed the last of the machinery. Here is the practical test, and it takes 5 seconds. Push your fingers down into the plant and look at the stems. Wherever you can still see small green or silver leaves on the stem, you can cut. The moment the stem is bare and woody, stop. Leave at least 1 good set of leaves below every cut, ideally 2. About 1/3 off the green growth is a comfortable annual shaping cut. Almost nobody ever gets in trouble for taking less. Now here is a connection I have honestly never heard anyone make out loud, and it is why a pruning tip belongs in a video about winter survival. The shape you cut into that plant in late summer is the shape that either sheds water in February or holds it. A rounded dome sheds rain, it sheds snow, Air moves over it and around it. A flat top, or a plant allowed to open into a hollow ring with a gap in the middle, does the opposite. It collects. Snow settles into the dish and sits there. Rain runs inward toward the crown instead of outward away from it. That plant stays wet for days after its neighbor has dried. You are not pruning for looks. You are pruning a roof. Timing. Finish any shaping cut while you still have roughly 4 to 6 weeks of decent growing weather ahead of your average first frost. Cut surfaces need to dry and seal, and any small regrowth the cut triggers needs time to firm up and go woody before the cold arrives. If that window has already closed where you live, here is the honest answer. Deadhead only. Take the spent stalks off and leave the shaping for spring. A slightly shaggy lavender that survives beats a beautifully shaped one that does not. And a word on which lavender you actually own, because garden centers sell them side by side with no warning. English lavender is generally rated hardy to around zone 5. The bigger hybrid lavandins, generally around zone 6. Spanish and French lavender, the ones with the showy little rabbit ears on top of the flower head, are often not reliable below about zone 8, and in a cold garden they belong in a pot that comes in. Check your local extension office and your own ooze to hardiness zone before you decide what your plant should be able to take. One last thing that costs nothing. Wipe your blades between plants. The Royal Horticultural Society documents a fungal disease of lavender called shab, and dirty pruners are one way it travels. Thing 2 runs directly against instinct, and the instinct is a kind one, which is why it is so hard to argue people out of. The plant just spent 6 weeks flowering. It looks a little tired. Surely it is hungry. Surely we should reward it. Please do not. Here is what that plant is actually doing right now, and it is one of the more beautiful pieces of plant physiology I know. As days shorten and nights start cooling, a hardy plant switches programs. It stops running the growth program and starts running the hardening program. It slows shoot extension. It moves sugars and starches into storage. It changes the fat composition of its cell membranes so they stay flexible instead of brittle at low temperature. And it builds a family of protective proteins whose job is to hold cells together when water is pulled out of them and ice forms in the spaces outside. That whole process is a shift from grow to seal. Now, what does a shot of nitrogen say to a plant in late summer? One word: grow. So you get a flush of soft, pale, thin-walled, water-filled shoots. Those shoots have not lignified, which is the word for laying down woody reinforcement in the cell walls. They are the first tissue to blacken in the first hard freeze, and in a wet autumn they are an open doorway for gray mold. And there is a third cost that ties straight back to our model. All that soft growth makes the canopy denser, and a denser canopy traps humidity down in the middle of the plant, which shortens the drying window, so the fertilizer does not merely fail to help. It attacks the one variable that decides whether the plant lives. Second reason, and it is about what kind of plant this is. Lavender is a poor ground specialist. On rich soil, you do not get a better lavender. You get a bigger, floppier, leafier one, with fewer flower spikes and a wetter interior. Extension guidance out of the real lavender growing regions, Oregon State University and Washington State University among them, consistently describes lavender as a low fertility crop. That is not folklore. That is how it is farmed. And now the third reason, which is the one this channel exists for. Lavender forms arbuscular mycorrhizal partnerships. Fungal threads far finer than any root hair grow out from the root into pores in the soil that a root can never physically enter, and they trade minerals and water back to the plant in exchange for sugar. For a plant built to live in lean, stony ground, that partnership is not a bonus feature. It is the business model. Here is the catch, and it is well documented across a great many crops. When phosphorus is abundant in the soil, mycorrhizal colonization goes down, which makes perfect economic sense from the plant side. If the nutrient is lying around free, why keep paying a contractor in sugar? So when you feed a lavender, you are not simply feeding it, you are firing its business partner. Now an honest note, because I would rather be trusted than exciting. Do not run out and buy a bag of mycorrhizal inoculant either. Results from bagged products applied to ordinary garden soil that already contains its own native fungi, are inconsistent in the research literature, and I am not going to sell you certainty I do not have. The free move here is not to add fungi. It is to stop suppressing the ones already living in your ground. So what do you actually do this autumn? Nothing. If your soil is genuinely poor, next spring you can scatter a thin layer of finished compost around the plant, kept a good hand's width back from the stems. That is it. And before anybody adds lime because they read that lavender likes it, get a soil test. Lavender is comfortable in roughly neutral to slightly alkaline ground, and an enormous number of garden soils are already sitting there. Your county extension office can tell you where you stand for very little money. Guessing is how people wreck a bed. Thing 3 is water, and the reason most watering advice fails is that it answers the wrong question. Almost everyone asks how much. The question that actually decides whether that plant is alive in May is how long does it stay wet. Once the bloom is over, start stretching the interval. Not cutting the volume, stretching the interval. When you do water, water deeply, then leave it alone considerably longer than feels comfortable. There is a real mechanism under that. Deep, infrequent watering pulls root growth downward because roots follow moisture. Frequent shallow watering parks the root system in the top few inches of soil. And the top few inches is exactly the layer that freezes, thaws, refreezes, and stays saturated all winter. Shallow watering in September is you personally moving that plant's roots into the most dangerous neighborhood in the yard. For an established lavender in the ground, in most of the country, the honest answer for autumn is that it needs no supplemental water at all, except in a genuine extended drought. First-year plants are the exception. Their roots are still a small ball in a big world, so keep watering deeply and infrequently into early fall, then taper. When you do water, water at the base and water in the morning. Never over the top of the plant. A lavender going into a cold night with wet foliage is running a small experiment on gray mold, and the mold usually wins. Now here is where I am going to disagree with most of the internet, and I am doing it on purpose. Everything I just told you assumes you have a wet winter. Plenty of you do not. If you garden where winter is cold and dry and windy, and that describes a great deal of the Intermountain West, the high plains and the Front Range, the danger runs in the opposite direction. Evergreen and semi-evergreen plants keep losing water out of their foliage on bright, windy winter days. If the root zone is bone dry and frozen, they cannot replace what they lose. They dry out and die of thirst while standing in snow. Colorado State University Extension has published fall and winter watering guidance for exactly this situation for many years, and the shape of it is this. On a day when air temperature is above roughly 40 degrees Fahrenheit and the soil is not frozen, water in mid-morning so it soaks in and drains away before the temperature drops at night. Roughly once a month through a dry winter is often plenty. So the correct advice actually reverses depending on which winter you have. If your winter is wet, your enemy is water. If your winter is dry and windy, your enemy is thirst. Almost nobody says that out loud, and I think it explains why so much lavender advice on the internet appears to contradict itself. Half of it was written in Oregon, and half of it was written in Colorado, and both halves are right where they were written. Which brings me back to something I will keep repeating on this channel. Nobody can hand you a watering schedule. They can only hand you a mechanism, and then you go look at your own ground and do the arithmetic yourself. Thing 4 is drainage, and drainage is where this whole topic either gets solved permanently or argued about forever. Start with a free test, because I would rather you measure than guess. Dig a hole about 12 inches deep and about a foot across, near where the lavender lives or where you intend to put one. Fill it with water and let it drain completely. That first fill is only there to wet the soil so it does not lie to you. Then fill it a second time and time it. Draining faster than about an inch an hour, you are in good shape. Slower than about a quarter of an inch an hour, you have a real problem, and no amount of clever pruning is going to solve it. While you are down there, do the ribbon test, the same rough field test soil scientists with the Natural Resources Conservation Service use. Take a lump of moist soil, squeeze it between your thumb and the side of your forefinger, and push a ribbon of soil out over the edge of your thumb. No ribbon at all, you are sandy. A ribbon that breaks under an inch, you are in loam. 2 inches or more and slick and shiny, that is clay, and now you know what you are dealing with. Now the myth, and this one is expensive and stubborn. Add sand to clay to loosen it up. Please do not. Adding a modest quantity of sand to a clay soil tends to fill the pore spaces between the fine particles, rather than open them. In the wrong proportion, you reduce total pore space instead of increasing it, and gardeners have been describing the result for a century in one word: concrete. To genuinely change the texture of a clay soil, you would need a volume of sand that nobody in a home garden is ever actually going to move. So here is the honest fix, and it is one of my favorite things in gardening because it is so blunt. Do not amend downward. Build upward. Make a berm. Mound the planting area 8 to 12 inches above the surrounding grade, 3 feet or so across, using soil you already have. You have not changed one thing about your clay. You have simply moved the crown of that plant above the water. Elevation is drainage. It is free, it works in every soil on Earth, and it is the highest leverage thing in this entire video. Then, the gravel collar. 2 to 3 inches of coarse gravel, crushed rock or coarse grit, laid right around the base of the plant and out about a foot. This is where a lot of good gardeners have it exactly backwards, and it is not their fault. Bark, straw, leaves, compost. All wonderful materials, and I use them everywhere else. But look at what they are for. They are chosen precisely because they hold moisture. That is the entire point of them. Which makes them precisely the wrong thing to press against a lavender crown in November. Gravel does not hold water. It does not mat down. It dries between rains, and on a bright winter day, it warms and dries faster than the soil around it. It also stops soil splashing up onto the lower stems in heavy rain, which matters, because those swimming spores we talked about ride raindrops. Now I can hear the objection, because it is the name of this channel. Feed the soil, not the plant. Am I really telling you to put rock on your soil? Yes, in one specific place, and here is how the two ideas fit together. Feeding the soil around a lavender is a spring job, done with a light hand, 6 or 8 inches away from the stem where the feeder roots actually are. The last couple of inches right next to the crown are not a dinner plate. They are a drain. A living soil philosophy is not a rule you apply with your eyes shut. It is knowing which part of the ground you are talking about. 2 more free ones. Airflow. Give the plant real space, 2 to 3 feet from its neighbors, and mean it. Then go out this autumn and clear fallen leaves out of the base of every lavender you own. A wet mat of maple leaves packed over a lavender crown is one of the most reliable ways to kill one that I know, and it happens by accident every single year to people who did nothing wrong. And the last one, which is my favorite diagnostic in all of gardening, because it costs a wet coat. Go outside during the storm. Not after it, during it. Put a raincoat on and stand out there and watch. Watch where the water runs. Watch where it puddles and how long the puddle lasts. Watch what the downspout is doing to the corner of that bed. Notice which patch of ground is still shiny an hour after the rain stops, because that patch is telling you exactly where not to plant a lavender. Almost nobody does this. It is worth more than any product you will ever buy. Thing 5 is for everybody growing lavender in a container, and if that is you, this is probably the most important stretch of this video, because container plants die of things in ground plants never even notice. Start with the mechanism, as always. Roots are less cold-hardy than shoots, considerably less. The top of a hardy plant can shrug off temperatures that would kill the root system of that same plant outright. In the ground, this rarely matters, because soil is an enormous thermal battery. A foot down, the temperature barely moves compared to what the air is doing. The ground protects the part that most needs protecting. A pot has no battery. A container out on a patio is exposed to cold air on every side, and its root ball tracks the air temperature rather than the soil temperature. Nursery growers have had a rule of thumb about this for decades. A plant in a container is reliably hardy about 1 to 2 zones warmer than its rated hardiness. So a lavender rated to zone 6, sitting in a pot in zone 6, is quietly being asked to behave like a zone 4 or 5 plant. Then add freeze and thaw. Every cycle expands and contracts the root ball, shears fine roots, and heaves the whole mass. Terracotta soaks up water and splits along the way. So, here is the order of operations, ranked by how much good each one actually does. First, and by a wide margin, get the pot out of the rain. under a deep eave, tight against the north or east wall of the house, or better still, into an unheated garage, shed, or cold porch. A pot standing in the open, collecting winter rain, with a saucer underneath acting as a reservoir, is the entire disaster in one image. Take the saucer off, permanently. Second, and this catches good-hearted people every single year, do not bring it into a warm room, please. A heated house breaks dormancy with almost no light to support it, and you get pale, stretched, weak growth and a dead plant by February. The word is unheated. Cold is fine. Cold is what it wants. Wet is what kills it. Third, raise the pot. Pot feet, 2 bricks, a scrap of lumber, anything, so the drainage holes never sit in a puddle or freeze shut against concrete. Fourth, group your pots together and put the lavender in the middle if you have several. A cluster buffers temperature swings for everything in it. Fifth, if you are choosing a pot, bigger is better. More volume means more thermal mass and slower swings. And frost-proof material, not thin terracotta. Sixth, do not repot in the fall. I know it is tempting when the plant looks tired. Fresh potting mix packed around a small root ball is a reservoir with nothing drinking out of it. Wait until spring. Seventh, check the moisture about once a month while it is stored. Barely moist is the target. Not soggy, but not dust-dry either, because a bone-dry root ball in a cold garage will desiccate just as surely as a wet one will rot. And one word about the mix itself. Straight-bagged potting mix holds far too much water for this plant through a winter. Cut it heavily with coarse grit, pumice or perlite. A third of the volume is a reasonable starting point, and more is not a mistake. You are trying to build a limestone hillside inside a plastic pot, and the mix is the only lever you have. Now the diagnostic, because come spring you will be standing over a sad-looking plant trying to decide what happened. And this matters enormously, because the correct response to each is the opposite of the other. If it was cold, you wait and you prune, and the site is fine. If it was rot, the site is wrong. And if you plant a new lavender in the same spot without changing anything, you are simply buying the same funeral again next year. Here is how they look different. Cold injury runs from the top down and from the outside in. The tips are gray and brittle and snap. But scratch the bark low on a main stem with your thumbnail and you find green underneath. The damage is often worse on one side of the plant, usually the windward side or the side that took winter sun. The plant is still firmly anchored, and when you tug it, it does not move. And eventually, sometimes very late, new growth pushes out of the lower leafy wood. Root and crown rot looks entirely different. It takes the whole plant at once, and here is the timing tell that gives it away. The collapse usually happens after growth has already started, during the first warm, dry, windy stretch of spring. The foliage wilts and goes dull even though the soil is plainly moist, and that combination, wilting in wet soil, is the classic signature. The crown is dark and soft where it ought to be firm, and sometimes there is a sour smell down at soil level. Pull the roots through your fingers, and the outer layer slips off like a wet sock, leaving a bare thread behind. The plant lifts out with almost no resistance, and very often it is one plant, or the plants at the low end of a row, rather than the whole planting. One line to remember. Cold injury shows up as damage that limits new growth. Rot shows up as collapse after new growth starts. Now a plea for patience, and I mean this one. Lavender is famously slow to wake up. It is one of the last things in my garden to show any sign of life. Do not condemn a plant in early April. Give it until the end of May before you dig it. I have watched plants that looked like a bundle of firewood push new shoots from the base in the last week of May. And if you have lost several plants and you genuinely want to know why, there is a real answer available that almost nobody uses. Most land-grant universities run a plant diagnostic clinic that will examine a sample and tell you what is actually in the tissue, usually for a modest fee. That is a laboratory result instead of a guess made from a photograph, and your county extension office can tell you how to submit one. And now the safety note, which I am not going to skip. Do not reach for a fungicide drench as your first move. Products aimed at water molds are largely preventive. They are of limited value once a plant is already collapsing, and some of them are restricted to licensed applicators. If you use any garden chemical at all, read the label every single time and follow it exactly. including the parts about protective equipment and about pets and children. But please hear the larger point. The durable fix for a water mold problem is not chemistry, it is drainage. You cannot spray your way out of a low spot. Let me put 6 common pieces of lavender advice on the table and tell you honestly which ones survive contact with the evidence. 1. Sand fixes clay. Mostly no, not at any quantity a home gardener actually applies. Raise the bed instead. 2. Feed it after it blooms to help it recover. No, late nitrogen delays cold hardening and produces exactly the soft tissue that dies first. 3. Mulch it heavily for winter protection. Good advice for a hosta, bad advice at a lavender crown. Gravel, not bark, and keep organic material back from the stem. 4. Lavender needs lime. It is comfortable and neutral to slightly alkaline soil, but a great many garden soils are already there, and adding lime blindly can push other nutrients out of reach. Test first. 5. Cut it back to the ground in fall like the rest of the perennials. A subshrub is not a herbaceous perennial. That cut removes the buds, and there is often nothing underneath to replace them. 6. It froze. Usually, it drowned. And now one piece of folklore I want to keep, honestly. In Old English and French gardens, lavender was traditionally planted on rubble banks, along the foot of stone walls, and on top of dry stone terraces. There is no controlled study behind that practice. It was tradition and habit, and frankly, it was using the ground nobody else wanted. But look at what it actually is. A raised, sharply drained, mineral-rich, sun-warmed, fast-drying position. It is very nearly a perfect prescription, arrived at by people who had never heard the word oomycete. I am not going to tell you science proved the old way. I am going to tell you the old gardeners were right, and almost certainly could not have told you why. Those are 2 different sentences, and the difference between them is most of what honesty in gardening means. Let me set expectations honestly, because a lot of disappointment in gardening is really just a timeline problem. Year 1. The plant is establishing. Bloom will be modest, and that is normal. Your entire job is drainage, no fertilizer, deadheading only, and no hard pruning. Surviving the first winter is the whole scorecard. Nothing else counts. Year 2. This is when you make your first proper shaping cut, and the year the dome either starts or does not. Bloom will be noticeably better. The habit you build now sets the shape of that plant for the rest of its life. Year 3. Peak form for most lavender. Full bloom flush, dense silver mound, and if you have shaped it every single year, there is very little bare wood showing at the base. And then, because I promised honesty, here is the part the plant tags leave off. Somewhere around year 5 to year 8, even a beautifully grown lavender begins to open at the center and go woody. That is not a failure on your part. That is what a subshrub does as it ages, and no pruning technique prevents it forever. Commercial lavender farms replace their rows on a schedule for exactly this reason. So plan for it rather than grieving over it. Lavender takes very easily from cuttings, which means the replacement for your favorite plant costs nothing but a little patience, and the time to think about that is while the parent is still in its prime. Now I would like to hear from you, and not politely. I would like an argument. First question, and it genuinely changes the answer. Which winter do you have? Wet and gray, or cold and dry and windy? Tell me your region and your soil down in the comments, because as we said, the correct watering advice flips between those two, and I want somebody reading those comments to be able to find a gardener who gardens where they garden. Second, here is where I will get myself in trouble. I do not believe weather is the main killer of lavender in American gardens. I think the main killer is a bag of shredded bark, spread by a kind and conscientious person on the same afternoon the plant went in the ground, pushed right up against the stem, by someone doing exactly what every source they had told them to do. Tell me I am wrong. I mean that sincerely. If you have kept lavender alive for a decade under bark mulch, I want to read that comment, because it would mean something about your soil that the rest of us ought to know. Third, and this is the one I care most about, what did the older gardeners in your family do with lavender in the fall? Some of you were raised in places where nobody did anything at all, where a plant sat in a stony strip beside a driveway, and lived 15 years, and nobody ever gave it a thought. That is data. That is a very good drainage story wearing plain clothes. And if anybody out there has a lavender that is 9 or 10 years old and still tight and dense at the base, please tell all of us how. That is rarer than it ought to be, and I would far rather learn it from you than guess. Here is what I actually want you to walk away with, and it is bigger than one plant. Almost all garden advice is written as a list of things to give. Give it water, give it food, give it mulch, give it protection. It is a generous way to think, and for a great many plants, generosity works beautifully. But some plants do not want to be given anything. They want conditions. Lavender is the plainest teacher of that lesson I have ever grown. Look back over these 5 things. Cut it for shape, stop feeding it, water it less often, lift it up and put stone at its feet, get the pot out of the rain. Every single one of them is subtraction rather than addition. And nearly everything that kills a lavender in a home garden is something a good person did for it out of kindness. Feed the soil, not the plant, is not only about compost. Underneath, it is an instruction to pay attention to the ground the plant is standing in, rather than to the plant. And for lavender, the kindest thing you own is a slope, a coffee can of gravel, an open shape, and the discipline to walk away and let it be dry. So go out this week, before the weather turns, kneel down, look at the place where those gray stems meet the soil, and ask one question. It is the only question in this entire video. After it rains here, how long does this stay wet? Everything else follows from your answer. If this changed the way you see that plant even slightly, leave a comment and tell me, because that is genuinely why I make these. The free blueprint with the whole method, the season-by-season timeline, the honest myth list, and every source I used is linked down in the description, and it will always be free. Take care of your ground. It will take care of the rest.